Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining the session this morning. We're delighted that you're all here, and you do look a lovely bunch. As Sven said, I'm Jean Mutton. I spent decades working in higher education, administration and management. And about 10 years ago, came across systems thinking, design thinking, service design. And at that time, I was working a lot around student experience, life cycle, and doing projects around that. And for me, all the ducks were in a row. So I'm not a lean expert, but I do have the little bit of knowledge of lean, and I'm more than happy to pull lean principles into service design and try and marry the two. And one of the things we'll be talking about is that a little bit later on. So my details are up on the screen now. Please do get in touch. I'm sort of semi-retired now, but my passion for human-centered research is such that it's just keeping me going. So I'll just hand over to Pam to say a few words about herself.
All right. Hello, everybody. Like was mentioned, I'm a Canadian living here in Finland. I'm now working at the Metropolitan University of Applied Science as a service designer. And I have worked in Canada, in Scotland, in Finland, and spent some time in Norway working on these different areas of international recruitment and student experience. And that's really kind of what got me into service design, and I graduated with an MBA in service innovation and design in 2017 and have been working together with Jean on different projects. And yeah, so let's get started on today.
Great, thank you. So what we're going to be doing today, well, there's going to be a networking session right at the very start. So I don't know about you, but one of the things I loved about conferences when we were able to have them in person was, you know, who would I meet, who would I talk to, who would I be sitting next to at lunch? So we're going to give you an opportunity to get into a breakout room, about just 4 or 5 of you, and get to know each other, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And then I'm going to say a little bit about lean and service design, and then we're going to go into what do you do in your institution about user research at the moment. And then Pamela is going to take us through the 5 most important things to master when doing user interviews, and then we've got a lovely little takeaway for you at the end, and there'll be time for some Q&A as well. So to kick us off, what we want you to do is as you see, there's a plug there. Now there's a word for people who see faces in things, and it's called, I hope I pronounce this correctly, pareidolia. And you'll know if you've ever seen a young baby smile at just a drawing that it's innate in us to respond to human faces. So what we want you to do, you'll have in a minute to find something in your workplace, in your home, that has a face. It could be an object or a picture. I've got Pog here, here's my little mouse. And then we're going to put you into your breakout rooms. This is the same breakout room you'll stay in for the entire session. So as you have this breakout room now, and then you'll go into a breakout room for 10 minutes later on. And we want you to get to know people and introduce your object and introduce yourself. So you've got 1 minute from now to find something, and then when you come back, we'll put you into the breakout rooms. Okay, you've got 1 minute from now.
What's in your room? Check the ceiling.
Find a picture.
That's right.
Draw a face. Whatever you want to do. That's 30 seconds.
Oh.
Don't forget, you need to introduce your object and also yourself, but you will only have 5 minutes to do this. So you do need to be pretty sharp about it. So don't hog the floor. Make sure everybody has a turn to speak. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. When you go into your breakout rooms, remember to click join, and then we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope it was a bit of fun for you. I think it's a great way to sort of have a little icebreaker, but also just remind people, you know, the faces and talking to people is so important, and it's a great way to sort of push it to one side. That it's not just all about you; it's about the object that you're talking about as well. So hope you enjoyed that. That's great. Right. The next slide is some people say that there's lean is versus service design, that they don't sort of work together, but we think that that's actually a false dichotomy, because if you look at some key definitions that have come out of the government digital service here in the UK, so what they say is, to a user, a service is simple. It's something that helps them to do something. Now, those of you who live in the UK may be familiar with gov.uk, which has been through a pretty serious service design process a few years ago. And those of you who've had to renew a passport or renew your car tax will know how much easier and straightforward it is now, and how much better that service is with regard to keeping you informed. When I ordered a new passport online, I got an email saying, yes, my photograph had been approved, my application had been approved, and then a couple of days later, my new passport was nearly ready. And then a couple of days later, it's in the post. So I knew exactly where I was. So I didn't need to keep badgering them to find out what was happening. They kept me informed. It was absolutely wonderful. And I picked this other quote out from the Lean Enterprise Institute, that the core idea is to maximize customer value while minimizing waste. So very simply, lean means creating more value for customers with fewer resources. And I was very mindful of when Steve Yorkstone was talking on the panel the other day, and he brought us back to this notion of respect for people is a key fundamental pillar of lean. So I think really there's more that pulls us together with the two methodologies than there is that keeps us apart. So if we could move to the next slide, thank you. So we both start with people. So you'll be familiar, if you know about the lean terminology, with Gemba, the place of action, the point of service delivery, the place where value is created. And particularly from a service design perspective, this happens both inside and outside the classroom. So there's a lot of talk about the student as customer, but in our view, if a student walks into a university library, how are they any less of a customer than if they walk into their local library? So there's a lot of areas where services would need to be created and need to be thought about with the end user. So if we could just move over to the next slide, Pamela, thank you. So some of you will be familiar with Ono and his chalk circle, where he described that the place of action, you need to go to the place of action, you need to draw a chalk circle on the factory floor and just look and listen and watch and see what is actually happening in the place where it happens. And we would also say, you know, talk to the people who are the end users. So our view is that Ono's chalk circle fits beautifully into the first quadrant of the Design Council's Double Diamond. Now, the Double Diamond, if you're not familiar with it, is a model of the service design process. And it's very important. The first quadrant is the research phase. So if you look at the bottom of the models, it's discover, define, develop, and deliver. And that discovery phase is the research phase. So this is where we gather the insights, we understand what is happening. This is where the user research actually takes place. It could be through diaries, it could be through interviews, it could be through shadowing, it could be through observation, it could be mystery shopping, but involves very much active listening that Ness Collingridge was talking about yesterday in her great presentation that she did. So after that, you'd move into the define phase, which is where you begin to frame the right question and then move into develop and deliver. But it's a very iterative process. So you would need to, once you've done that, go back, because when we're doing things like evaluation and prototyping, it's important not to lose sight of those early insights that we have had through the research phase. Now, one of the issues that I came across when I was working in higher education is that quite often we will move to what is the middle point of the two double diamonds, which is the specific problem. And quite often we will move to not only identifying what we think the problem is, but also what we think the solution is. Whereas the service design perspective is that you would go to the generic problem, which is right at the start of the issue, and begin to try and understand, try and frame the right design question. I'll give you an example of how that can be something else other than what you think it is. It's not an HE example, but Adam Lawrence, who runs the Global Service Jams, does tell a story about some work in an airport, and some service designers have been brought in because they felt that they needed to have a review of their washroom facilities, because there were always queues and they were always being overused, and they didn't, understand what was going on. So these service designers went in and began talking to these people in the toilets, and sort of said, why are you hanging around in here? Is there not enough facilities? Do we need to build more facilities? And they went, oh no, it's not that. There are loads of hard surfaces in here, and we can hear the announcements much better in this environment than we can in the general airport. So the airport staff were thinking they needed more washroom facilities, and what they actually needed was a better sound system. So it's very important with the service design perspective to go in with an open mind and not assume that you know what the problem is. And I think, Pamela, you might have an example that's similar.
Yeah, it's kind of a classic service design example. And this goes back to a hospital in the US where they were having problems keeping their schedule for the MRI machine. This was one that was specifically used for children, and they were always falling behind schedule. And basically this machine is worth, millions of dollars, and keeping a time schedule and using it efficiently was really, really important. And so, they decided to bring in some people to do some research because they needed help with this scheduling. There was obviously a problem with the scheduling. So they brought in some service designers, and basically they talked to the people that were using it. They talked to the nurses and doctors that were trying to kind of push these customers through. And in the end, what they found out was that actually the children were scared to go in the machine. And so for each child, it was taking much longer to convince them to go into this machine. And in the end, how they solved this problem was that they made it an experience for the children. They turned the machine into a big pirate ship. They got the children to dress up as pirates while they were in the waiting area. And then they were able to kind of like lead them in, and they were then kind of like much more accepting of going into this machine. And in that sense, the problem wasn't the scheduling, the problem was the fear. And had they not done this kind of like research where they interviewed all of the stakeholders, they would never have found that out and never would have solved the real problem. And this goes back to the perceived problem and the real problem. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. So what we'd like to do now is move you into your groups, the same groups you were in before. You'll have 10 minutes to discuss your current practice. What do you do with regard to user research? And have you got any thoughts about what you've just heard so far before we move into the second part of the presentation, which is our top tips for user research. So if we could go into the breakout rooms now, Susan, please. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. People are just filtering back in. I think everybody's back now, Susan. Yeah, that's great. Right, lovely. Well, I hope you found those fruitful discussions. Has anybody got any couple of examples, couple of headlines that you want to share with the room? Just unmute yourself or pop it in the chat.
We were talking about how, especially working with IT departments, we can be quite focused on getting the next shiny thing rather than looking at the processes, and sort of how do we affect that cultural shift from looking at being very solutions focused to exploring the potential problems and the processes before fixing on a shiny thing. Yeah. Shame we all like shiny things, but
yeah, that's really interesting. It reminds me of I was working with a university when apps were just starting to come in. And the Vice Chancellor, I think his daughter was at university, had an app, and that university, he said, oh, we've got to have an app, we've got to have an app. So it went down the chain of command to the head of IT, to the head of innovation, to the head of, and down to the person who was able to develop an app for the university. And this person, ran it, oh God, fantastic, I'll really get into this, and put this app together. And as an afterthought, contacted the student experience team and said, oh, I've been told, you might want to have a look at this. And we went along and said to him, do the students really want it? And his little face fell. It's like tumbleweed moment, I mean, it was a good app in the end, but there had been no student input at all in the design or the look or the content of that app. He just ran away and done it. And yeah, it needed some rework, let's put it that way. But yeah, thank you for that. That's very, very insightful. Thank you. That's really helpful. Anybody else? That's fine. Not to worry. Look, there'll be time for Q&A at the end as well. So you always have an opportunity to say something. Actually, speaking about Q&A, there's a question that popped up in the chat that we were looking at while you were in your breakout rooms. And it was about, how do you know, I think it's from Marianne, how do you know if a problem is specific or generic, or you're answering the right question? And I think that's a really interesting point. So we could just address that now, if that's okay. And it reminded me of a scenario where we were looking at improving student enrolment across a university that had lots of different satellite sites. And on one of the satellite sites, the dean of school of that particular area had said, oh, I don't want these queues, these students in queues, it's terrible. I'm going to throw a lot of staff at all of this. We can get the students through, so there's no queuing at all. And that's pretty much what happened. But when we were doing a debrief, I was talking to the frontline member of staff who'd been on the desk where the students come. And she said the students were like, where is everybody? Am I the only one on this course? And they said, actually, they wanted a little bit of queuing because they wanted to meet other students. They wanted to find out, they wanted to make those connections. So a little bit of queuing was what they wanted. They didn't mind that, whereas the dean had jumped forward with this solution that there needed to be no queues. He jumped forward with that assumption. And we now know that students are happy with not a lot of queuing, but a little bit of queuing, because that's where they make connections. So did you have an example, Pamela? Or?
I think in due of the time, we can maybe move forward instead of using another story.
Okay, fair enough. And we'll have a look at the other things in chat later. Yeah. So thank you very much for your feedback on that. So I'll move over to Pamela now, and she'll take you through 5 most important things to master when doing interviews.
All right. Thank you very much. So Jean and I have worked together on this one project we're called Change Heroes. And part of that has brought us to making a couple of kind of documents. And one of them is this 5 most important things to master when doing user interviews. Thought that would be really great to share with you guys here today. And so for a quick overview is, you have to master your own expectations of what you're going to find, the surrounding environment in which you are interviewing somebody, the questions you'll ask, how well you listen, and the notes you make. So these really make the experience of interviewing people kind of worthwhile and necessary to get really good, actionable research out of it. And so in this first one here, your own expectations. So asking why, even when you think you know the answer, will always teach you something. So why do you need to master your expectations? Because these will determine the kind of energy you bring into an interview, what you choose to hear, and how you follow up to the questions that you ask. So it is important to go into an interview with a plan, kind of regarding questions, like a loose plan. In service design, we call this like an interview guide. But one of the really important parts of the interview guide is that it is important to be flexible and kind of open to whatever may come from the person that you're interviewing. So you may have an idea where it may go, but in no way, shape, or form should you kind of point it in that direction. So the other issue you need to be aware of are the assumptions that you're going in with. So you have expectations, but you also have assumptions. You know, thinking that this is the problem or why is the problem. You know, these can really make an interview fairly useless if you're kind of like constantly pointing people towards one answer, or they feel that you expect them to give a certain answer. People will always want to please somebody else or give the right answer. And, you know, you don't want to kind of weigh too heavily on this. So this comes down to the questions you ask, which we'll touch on a little in a few minutes. So they will kind of see how you act and what you say, and they will act according to that, which can be less than useful for you. And mastering your kind of surrounding environment, so making the interviewee feel comfortable. It's really important. You know, the best way to do these interviews is in an environment that the interviewee is comfortable in. You know, and also if it's possible to conduct them in a place that is relevant to what you're asking. So if it's about classroom things, then maybe do it in a classroom. If it's about their journey to get to wherever they need to go, then maybe that is the appropriate place to have the interview. But something that's familiar to them and connected to what you're talking about will really help them feel comfortable. It will help you kind of build rapport with them, but it will also help to make them recall the things that you need to get access to. So, you know, another way of doing this, of making the interviewee feel comfortable is, you know, you've got to kind of, part of this environment is arriving on time, you know, the basic, you know, maybe not right now, but, you know, like a handshake, agreement of some kind, being relaxed and friendly and confident, and of course, polite and respectful, and basically trying to find some kind of common ground between you guys is really important in kind of managing and mastering the environment. And then, so we come questions that you ask. You know, the right questions can lead to the right answers. And by right answers, of course, we're just talking about what's useful. And we start with this closed questions versus open questions. And this is really the difference between no information or very little information and actionable information, you know, between a one-word answer and hearing a useful story from somebody. So closed questions are the ones that, you know, are answered with a yes or a no. It doesn't really take you very far, and it's much more difficult to follow up with a yes or no question. So it's not helpful to get information in that form. There's very little, there's no nuance, there's no insights that you can kind of take from those answers. But whereas responses to open questions are full of useful information, and you might not even notice it at the beginning. It might be when you go back and you review the notes or listen to the recording again, and it might not even be until you bring like all the data together that you really see, you know, what is important and what is kind of like extra to the story. So, you know, and combined with the others, the insights become much more significant. And open questions, you know, in general, we start with things like, what were the things that you thought about before you came to school today? What were the things in your mind? You know, and so they can tell you, they can go back into that situation and they can think about that. Another great one is tell me about the last time you registered for classes. What was that experience like? And they can tell you a story, or walk me through what you did in order to report a professor for poor behavior or whatever the question may be. You know, and these really bring out the stories that they have to tell and the context that they're working in. You will get details that you will not get asking, you know, very simple yes, no questions. And this is also about being able to ask why. You know, a student can say, well, it was a really difficult morning this morning, blah, blah, blah. They talk through this. And so why? And this is the difference in my mind between what's called, you know, big data and thick data. So we've all heard of big data. You get this massive amounts of data that come, but they have no context with them. Whereas thick data is kind of like, is data with context. So this is when people have asked why. So it's not so useful to know that 40% of students don't like using your registration page, right? That doesn't tell you anything. But when you have the chance to ask why, you will then find out some things that are actionable. So knowing that something isn't working is useful, but it does not really help to tackle any real problem that lies behind the service failure. And only knowing why the service is not working will move you forward to either create something new or to develop it properly. So make sure that any answers that are not clear to you that you get, that you ask why. Don't just kind of like let it go and think you'll deal with it later. And of course, not asking leading questions. The other issue that can come up with leading questions, I have an example here. You know, we have this, do you think that alumni relations could be better at communicating? So you've got a yes, no question there, which won't lead you, you know, they would say yes, or they would say no. And okay, you can kind of go on from there, but it's, you know, so the question has already suggested that there's a doubt that the communication is sufficient. And so people will take that lead and may go, well, maybe, I don't know. So, you know, maybe they will try to think of an answer that they think you want to hear. And to get more relevant data about somebody's preferences, you could ask a question kind of like, how do you feel about the communication that you get from the alumni relations office? And then you can follow up that with why, or another question that you have. So this, how do you feel, or walk me through, or these kind of more open questions. And then we have what has come up. I've heard, I didn't get to hear it myself, but I've heard from Jean that this has come up a few times already in the conference, this how well you listen. You know, this ratio, this 2 ears and 1 mouth. You know, there's a reason for that. So listening will be required, you know, at every point of the process. And the first time it's required through introspection, you know, and then this goes back to the going in with your expectations. You kind of need to listen to what your expectations are, what your assumptions are, and set those aside. When you go through, you know, you need to kind of listen when you're sitting there with somebody, to really listen to what they're saying. And it becomes really difficult, you know, when you're trying to write notes and you're trying to listen to them and you're trying to think of how you're going to respond, and you need to kind of slow that process down and really be kind of consciously listening. This is why many times in service design, we say that, you know, when you're going to do interviews, there should at least be 2 of you, one person who's to the notes, and then one person who's actually doing the interview. And that is really, really helpful. And also having a recording if it's possible. And then when you go through your notes again, pulling out insights, you know, listening again in another way to what those notes are actually telling you, and not trying to fit them into a narrative that you have. And this again, so the notes that you make, you know, your attention is vital, and so is your recall. because sometimes that's all we have is how we remember something that's taken place or something that somebody said to us. So, you know, ideally, like I mentioned, you would have two people and you would have an audio recording to go through. And it's really important that you hear what people are saying and not just take it at face value of what you think they're saying. So basically your notes will suffer if you need to observe body language, ask questions, probe with a deeper question, and write notes at the same time. So if you're trying to do all of those things, you will suffer. So what I would like to say here is that all of this information that I've talked about here, we will give you in this nifty little document. And so you'll be able to take this away and look at it. There's a little more information in there about, you know, looking at also the why you would want to do these, what's the purpose of doing interviews, how they can help your institution. So Jean and I have set up this Change Heroes, like we said, so we've created this. And I will, if I can, just give me a moment here, pop this into the chat. And where might it be here?
I could just jump
There
in.
we go. Yeah.
Just to say that we called it Change Heroes because that's what you are. You know, it's higher education reorganisations, quite a nifty acronym, but you are the heroes of change in your institution. So that's where the title came from. Yeah.
Yeah. We're all looking to kind of create a much better experience, whether it's for the students, whether it's for the staff, whether it's, you know, for anybody who interacts with it. It might be different stakeholders, how we can work more smoothly with external stakeholders. So that's why specifically we said here about user interviews, but they can also be stakeholder interviews. These work for all different kinds. And so now we move to the Q&A.